The road was rough and riddled with potholes. The driver seemed to find it amusing to hit every one of them at full speed, while I lay stretched across the hood, clinging for my life and finding nothing to hold on to. The windshield behind me had been folded down. The co-driver's legs rested on the hood, and I could feel the cold steel of his rifle pressed into my back. His finger hovered close to the trigger. I wondered what would happen if I slipped off, assuming I wasn't run over first. The Jeep tore into Spire and screeched to a halt outside a fenced tennis court. Inside, a large group of prisoners walked about in the sunshine. A guard opened the narrow gate. I was shoved hard from behind, stumbled over a low rail, and before I understood what was happening, I was lying flat on my stomach inside the court. When I stood up and brushed myself off, everyone burst out laughing. In my long coat, I must have looked ridiculous. Someone shouted, "Wigwam," and the name stuck. A year later, when I played football in American POW camps, my name still appeared on the team sheets as inside right, Wigwam. It was the first time I had ever seen black men up close. 2 of them stood guard at the gate. They looked imposing, and those of us who claimed to understand English could not make sense of what they were constantly calling out. Prisoners kept arriving, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Among them were several officers who looked even more miserable than the rest. No one wanted much to do with them. Wild rumors spread about our fate. Some said we would be shot. Others claimed we would become overseers on plantations or be sent to Indian reservations. Townspeople walked freely in the streets during the day, though a curfew was enforced at night. A truck arrived loaded with cardboard boxes. We queued, and each of us received 2 tins, one labeled K ration, the other C ration. Inside we found meat, biscuits, ground coffee, powdered milk, sugar, and sweets. It felt like manna from heaven. Real coffee had been unattainable for years. There was only one cold water tap inside the court. We stirred our powders into the water as best we could and drank it while walking around. With food and drink of that quantity and quality, we joked that we could have conquered Europe and the world. After dark, the temperature dropped sharply. By early morning, frost covered the ground. We were given cardboard for bedding, which we laid out along the fences. Those who had to keep walking through the night no longer laughed about my wigwam coat, in which I lay warmly wrapped. I remembered Russia, minus 54 degrees Celsius. This frost felt harmless by comparison. At dawn, we were loaded onto trucks again. Most of the drivers were black, and they drove like demons. One truck overturned at the bottom of an embankment. We heard shouting and screaming and saw prisoners crawl out from underneath like eels, those who could still crawl. What a way to die, I thought, just days after surviving the war. Our first destination was a farm near Baumholder. We were herded through a tunnel entrance into a large yard with a manure heap in the center, surrounded by solid buildings on all sides. Soon, soldiers arrived with shovels and ordered about a dozen of us, including me, to dig a trench 6 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and about 20 yards long. Many of us believed our fate had finally caught up with us. Those were the dimensions of a perfect mass grave. The yard fell silent. Only the guards' voices urging us on broke the stillness. I noticed a group of our men gathering near the entrance and watched closely. Overpowering the guards would have been easy. I was already measuring the nearest one, planning what I would do. When the trench was about 3 feet deep, a truck arrived carrying drums of chemicals and wooden beams. Panic spread. We assumed the chemicals were for our bodies, the beams for gallows. Then a German-speaking American arrived with hammers and a bucket of long nails. He asked for carpenters and explained that a structure was to be built over the trench, with 2 beams running parallel from end to end. Only then did we understand. The word Scheisshaus spread like wildfire. Suddenly, laughter erupted. The guards stared at us in confusion, unable to understand why their strange German captives were laughing so loudly, their faces glowing with relief. In one corner of the yard, several SS men sat together, desperately trying to remove their insignia. Their arrogance had vanished. When I pointed out that their uniforms were a different cloth, color, and cut, they shrugged helplessly. It would do them no good anyway. The blood group tattoo under their arms could not be erased. German thoroughness had backfired. During the night, many more prisoners arrived. By morning, there was barely room to stand. A large convoy then transported us across the Belgian border to the garrison town of Stenay. We were unloaded onto a wide meadow along a narrow river behind old Napoleonic barracks. Large round tents stood on the field. Inside each tent, the ground was covered with massive stones. 20 of us were ordered into each tent. When we began moving the stones, the guards stopped us. Complaining was useless. We learned quickly to endure. The nights were horrific. No one could stretch out. We either curled around the stones or sat on them until morning. Guards laughed about us. Only trips to the latrine were permitted. The next march took us to a railway station, where a long train of open coal wagons waited behind a steam engine. The next march took us to a railway station, where a long train of open coal wagons stood waiting behind a steam locomotive. We were lined up on the forecourt and given a final warning to throw away any remaining weapons, pistols, knives, sticks, bottles, or pieces of metal. I had decided to keep a bottle of water, which I had hidden under my wigwam coat. After the last warning, spot checks began. A big, burly soldier, perhaps intrigued by the size of my coat, came straight toward me. He searched me thoroughly and found the bottle. Without a word, he struck me hard across the face. I reeled and fell into the dust. Blood poured from my mouth and nose. My first instinct was blind rage. I wanted to hit back. But when I turned my head and saw the legs of other soldiers approaching, their submachine guns ready, my anger evaporated instantly. I realized that one sudden movement could be my last. Slowly, very slowly, I stood up, wiped the blood from my face, and rejoined the ranks. The soldiers cursed at me. I didn't mind. I understood only half of it anyway. What hurt more were the angry reproaches from some of my comrades, who accused me of provoking a dangerous situation that could have endangered us all. Between 40 and 50 of us were packed into each open wagon. There was only room for a few to sit. Most had to stand. Everything was coated in coal dust. The journey lasted nearly 2 days through the industrial regions of northern France. We were never allowed to leave the wagons. Rain soaked us repeatedly. Coal dust mixed with the ashes and sparks from the engine. Soon we looked and felt like blackened caricatures. Our eyes turned pink from constant rubbing. Sanitation became a desperate problem. With no facilities, we used our empty food tins. At railway crossings, jeering crowds often waited for our train. We emptied the tins over them. Their laughter turned into furious howls when they realized what had been poured on them. They hurled stones and debris at the end wagons, punishing comrades who had no idea why. At Cherbourg, we were unloaded at the main station. The platform had been barricaded. It was midday, warm and sunny. American soldiers formed a cordon on both sides as we marched through the town. The townspeople, recently freed from German occupation, quickly realized that roles had reversed. Jeers and shouts no longer bothered us much, but the objects they threw did. I was struck on the back of the head by something hard. Then a young Frenchman made a fatal mistake. He broke through the American cordon, believing he could strike freely. He was wrong. Without orders, he was pulled into our column. In seconds, Bare fists settled the matter. When he was dragged away, blood stained the cobblestones. In a strange way, I regard that as my last act of the war. Some guards smoked, and when they tossed cigarette butts to the ground, a few prisoners dove for them. I found it repulsive. The Prussian soldier in me still clung to pointless ideas of honor. The camp lay outside town on the cliffs, overlooking the English Channel. We passed abandoned Atlantic Wall bunkers. An old sergeant walked beside me. He had defended them on D-Day. He told me of the bombardment, the ships appearing at dawn, the chaos, fear, and death. Nature had already begun to reclaim the concrete with green growth. A soft sea breeze blew in. Everything looked peaceful. The camp was divided into cages, separated by high fences and barbed wire. Each cage held about 20 large tents, roughly 100 men per tent. We slept on the ground, but had plenty of cardboard to insulate us. Between the tent rows lay open ground where we played football and organized chess and card tournaments. Lectures were held on all kinds of subjects. Each cage had a German leader and interpreter to relay American orders. Everything ran smoothly. The food was excellent, better than anything we had received in our own army. We were issued American mess tins and required to disinfect them before and after use. The Americans were meticulous about hygiene. Medical care was available to anyone who asked. Delousing, however, was another matter. Heavy-set soldiers filled bicycle pump-like devices with white powder and blasted it into our clothing. The stinging, coughing, and choking made us look like overworked millers. The relief was brief. Within days, the lice returned. Forks were considered dangerous, so we were issued spoons only. That problem was solved quickly with stones and ingenuity. Within days, everyone had proper cutlery. Church services were held almost daily. Since it was the only way out of the cage, I attended all of them, regardless of denomination. After one service, a young American priest led a discussion. He was prepared to forgive us personally, but compared our campaign in Russia to the Crusades. We had heard that argument before. When reminded of it, he had no answer. One day I noticed the stars and stripes at half-mast. Roosevelt was dead, a guard told me, and Hitler was still alive. 2 weeks later, we were marched to the port and loaded onto a ship. 2 weeks later, we were marched down to the port and loaded onto a ship. Each of us received a single blanket. We slept packed together in long rows on the iron floor of the hold. It was obvious that the officer in charge disliked us. At the far end, beside an iron ladder, stood a huge oil drum with sharp edges. It served as the only latrine for roughly 500 men. When it filled to the rim, no effort was made to empty it. The contents sloshed over the sides, spreading an unbearable stench through the hold, until an American Army doctor finally intervened. We crossed the channel between the Isle of Wight and Southampton, then sailed west along the English coast until we joined a larger convoy, which I assumed had come from Bristol. At school, we had learned that slaves had once been shipped from Bristol to America. Now we lay in the holds, traveling the same route to work in America. After rounding Ireland, we merged with another massive convoy, likely from Liverpool. Altogether, there were more than 100 ships. We were allowed on deck during daylight hours. I found everything fascinating. The convoy zigzagged constantly, destroyers darting between the ships. Dolphins and flying fish followed us, and after the first bouts of seasickness passed, we enjoyed the food and the strange adventure. One evening, sirens wailed and bells rang. The crew panicked slightly. We were ordered onto deck with our life vests. It was a U-boat alarm. We stood at the rail wearing our caps, perhaps so we would be recognized as German soldiers. It struck me as bitter irony that after fighting for years in Russia, I might now be sunk mid-Atlantic on an American ship by a German submarine. Soon, the alarm sounded again. All clear. The days alternated between calm sunshine and violent seas. Walking the iron decks in nailed jackboots during rough weather was difficult. After 21 days, the announcement came. Land in sight. Those words were magic. Climbing the steep iron ladder, we saw America rise on the horizon. Then came the Statue of Liberty, familiar from photographs. Sailing up the Hudson River, New York appeared. Bridges, skyscrapers, endless traffic along the docks. We docked. America, we have arrived. At the gangway stood an officer with a counting machine. Beside him hovered a man shouting, "Schnell, schnell!" Halfway down, I noticed he held a pin, which he jabbed into the backsides of those he could reach. Everyone tried to pass him as quickly as possible. Later we heard that no troop ship had ever been unloaded so fast. A small pin can be remarkably effective. We arrived on May 8, 1945. Still in the hold, we heard that sirens were sounding across New York. Hitler was dead. The war was over. The news left us numb. I didn't know whether to mourn or cheer. None of us felt like discussing it. The weight of the Nazi past pressed heavily on us. We had never imagined a Germany without Hitler, and none of us had dared criticize him while he lived. On the dock, we were ordered to place all our belongings on the ground and were thoroughly searched. I had carried a bundle of Reichsmarks since my last payday. The soldier searching me put it straight into his pocket. Our troop train consisted of modern coaches. The soft seats astonished us. Inside, glossy brochures documented German crimes in concentration camps. At first, I believed the photos were fakes. On second glance, I knew they were real. Remembering Russia, the scale of the crimes I had been part of, collectively, became horrifyingly clear. Germany, my Germany, how far had you fallen? No one discussed the brochures. Leaving the dock area, we saw slums, then more pleasant suburbs. We were stunned by the number of cars in factory parking lots. In Germany, almost no worker owned a car. America must be unimaginably rich. We passed Baltimore, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, El Paso. Names that sounded mythical. Oklahoma's soil was red. Crossing the Rockies, pulled by 3 massive oil-fired steam engines, we were deeply impressed. In Texas, oil derricks nodded across the plains. Then came the Rio Grande, nearly dry. Mexico lay beyond. For a fleeting moment, freedom crossed my mind. Armed guards ended that thought. The journey continued through New Mexico and Arizona. Lavatory doors were removed so guards could watch us. Windows stayed shut. The heating blasted during the day and was turned off at night. We sweated like animals. A friendly American captain visited our coach once. He had been to Germany before the war and asked us to sing. We tried, but under the merciless sun and soaked in sweat, it was impossible. He understood. We arrived at Florence Camp, Arizona, in the cool early hours of May. Ordered off the train, we dumped everything, uniforms, underwear, boots, belts, into a pile. Gasoline was poured over it and set alight. It felt like a violent severing of the past. I stood naked, filthy, thin, and exhausted in a strange land. Only my wristwatch remained. Then that too was stolen under a towel. For the first time in my life, I owned nothing. Strangely, I felt free. After the burning pile of uniforms, we were marched into a long barracks room. 2 muscular soldiers in white coats stood just inside the door. One by one, they grabbed us and drove injection needles deep into our upper arms. One man collapsed on the floor. No one laughed. From there, we were handed over to barbers. Rough men pushed us onto low stools and ran electric clippers across our heads until every trace of matted hair was gone. When we looked at one another afterward, we could hardly recognize ourselves. When I finally saw my own reflection, I felt a shock of disgust and shame. Then came the showers. Warm, soft water poured over our bodies. It was a sensation I had not known for years. It felt as if everything, the filth, the fear, the past, was being washed away and disappearing down the drain beneath my feet. The soap was real soap, not the miserable substitute we had known throughout the war. Clean towels were issued. But when I reached for mine, I discovered my wristwatch had been stolen. That was the moment when I owned absolutely nothing. And strangely enough, that emptiness brought a feeling of freedom I had never experienced before. We lined up and were issued underwear, socks, soft leather shoes, and a brand new American khaki uniform. The sensation of clean fabric on my skin was indescribable. I moved my arms, bent over, shrugged my shoulders, almost laughed out loud. I felt reborn. From there, we were led into a brightly lit dining hall. Long, spotless tables lined the walls. German prisoners served us a hot meal. It was one of the finest I had ever eaten. No one spoke much. A man opposite me asked me to kick him, just to make sure he was awake. Coffee followed. Real coffee, with creamy milk and sugar, as much as we wanted. This all happened around 3 in the morning. Later, we were shown into white wooden barracks. Everything was clean. Beds stood in neat rows, each with a soft mattress and fresh linen. I lay down, stared at the moonlight touching the foot of my bed, and thought of my mother. I did not know if she was alive. I slept. We remained at Florence camp for several weeks. At first, I felt ill, perhaps from the injections or the heat. But soon my strength returned. Life settled into routine. We ate, slept, played football and chess, and talked about home during the cool evenings. A German library had been set up, stocked with works by Kant, Schopenhauer, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Nietzsche. I read eagerly, though I often felt my education was insufficient to grasp their wisdom fully. Each afternoon, a sandstorm swept in from the desert, howling briefly before vanishing. Everything was coated with dust afterward. The camp already held thousands of prisoners, many from Rommel's Afrika Korps. Some resented us, accusing us of surrendering too easily. I had little patience for such arguments. Having fought in Russia, I could stand my ground. Conveniently, I avoided mentioning Tunisia. Politically, Nazi influence still dominated through habit and fear rather than conviction. Not long before our arrival, Camp Nazis had hanged a fellow prisoner in a latrine for openly criticizing Hitler. I was shown the beam. After that, I spoke carefully. Soon, I learned that American intelligence was far more anti-communist than anti-fascist. SS men had little to fear. This disturbed me deeply. Austria was now independent, and an area of the camp was reserved exclusively for Austrians. A sign declared, "Only for Austrians. Germans not wanted." We marched through their section daily to make a point. The great event was a football match between Germans and Austrians, which nearly erupted into violence. In June, about 1,000 of us were transported north to Montana. Our camp lay near Laurel, by the Yellowstone River, not far from Billings. Snow-covered peaks of Yellowstone National Park were visible every day. We worked in groups, hoeing sugar beets, back-breaking labor. German-American farmers spoke our language. When rations were cut, we collectively reduced our output. The rations were restored. Afterward, we traveled through Idaho and Oregon into California, to a camp near Windsor. Rolling green hills, comfortable tents, abundant food. We picked hops and fruit, played sports, staged performances, and received generous help from the YMCA. Boredom bred trouble. A friend named Fisher suggested escape. Armed only with wire cutters, 4 of us slipped out one night. Freedom lasted less than a day. Policemen found our bags. They treated us politely and returned us to camp. We received 3 days' punishment. Argentina would have to wait. Later came work near the Canadian border, then Arizona again, cotton picking near the Rio Grande. For the first time, we worked alongside Black and Mexican laborers. Their treatment troubled me deeply. A new camp commandant arrived, Jewish and proud of it. He announced harsh conditions modeled after concentration camps. We responded by slowing our work drastically. The policy ended within days. He disappeared. Christmas was celebrated with candles and songs. Passing motorists stopped to listen and applauded. Eventually, I was transferred back to Florence, where an officer named Lieutenant Hightower offered me work in the PX. I learned to type, worked as his assistant, and experienced kindness I had never expected. When I left, there were tears. Re-education meetings followed. One day I spoke out against the roots of war itself. Nazis threatened me afterward. Football saved me from worse. Later, I drove a Jeep across California, lost in Los Angeles, amazed by America's casual efficiency. At March Camp, we lived well, performed music, played sports, and waited, without news from home. When illness struck, I was treated with care. Then came the return east. In winter, we crossed the continent again, reaching New York after 3 days. Cold rain greeted us at Camp Shanks, where we waited impatiently, convinced that home was finally near. When we boarded the troop ship, officers informed us that we would be taken to Bremerhaven and released. Compared to the westward crossing, this voyage felt almost luxurious. Each man had his own bunk, and we were allowed free movement around the ship day and night. After 1 week, we entered Liverpool. We assumed it was only a brief stop. We were wrong. Orders came suddenly. We were to take all our belongings and line up on deck. British personnel boarded the ship. There were friendly handshakes between British and American officers. Then we were marched down the gangway and onto a train that carried us through Manchester to Altrincham in Cheshire. Only then did it sink in. The Americans had handed us over to the British. We arrived at a camp outside town. Inside a hut stood long tables and chairs arranged lengthwise. The atmosphere smelled of authority and unease. Outside, we could hear the low hum of hundreds of voices, our comrades waiting. 3 British officers entered, one carrying law books under his arm. A young woman with a notepad sat down quietly. We had nothing, no papers, no notes, no plan. The imbalance was crushing. The senior officer, a colonel, spoke first. Polite words about the weather. He mentioned having been to Germany recently and thought conditions there were improving. Then he asked who among us was the leader. We had never chosen one. Democracy, we thought naively, made that unnecessary. Because my English was slightly better, my comrades pushed me forward. "All right, Obergefreiter," the colonel said sharply. "What seems to be the problem?" "The Americans released us," I said. "But they did so in the wrong place. This is England, not Germany." "That is correct," he replied coldly. "And?" "The war has been over for more than a year. None of us has fought Britain. You cannot take us prisoner now." "Who says so?" "I do." "And who are you?" "An enlisted man of the German Wehrmacht." The lawyer smiled and asked what legal basis I relied upon. "Geneva Convention," I said, already knowing I was lost. "Which article?" he asked pleasantly. I had no answer. Neither did my comrades. The colonel closed the matter with irritation. Next time you make an official complaint, prepare it properly. And if I were you with your history, I would never mention the Geneva Convention again. We were dismissed. Outside, chaos erupted. Men demanded answers. Whistles, curses, accusations. My comrades pointed at me. Standing there on the steps of the hut, I made a decision. Never again would I speak for others. We were split up. With a few hundred men, I was sent south to Romsey in Hampshire. England felt strange. Small, old, reserved. The people were friendly but distant. Life moved slowly. Yet there was something deeply humane about it. From Romsey, we worked on farms. Later, I was transferred to Hazelhurst, an old country house. For the first time in years, I felt something like freedom. Later still, I worked in West Meon, tending gardens. The kindness of the families, and especially the children, meant more to me than they could ever know. In 1948, I was released. I returned to Germany to find both my parents dead, my home destroyed. I owned nothing but an American kit bag. Germany felt hostile and silent. No one wanted to speak about the war. I went back to England. I worked as a farm laborer, played football, and slowly felt human again. I married a Swiss woman in 1952. We had 2 children. I worked on the railway until retirement. My wife died in 1980. Now, near the end of my life, guilt weighs heavily, especially for what was done in Russia. I do not know whether my life has been a tragedy, a crime, or a strange comedy. I regret the suffering I caused others. I do not complain about what was done to me. That is all.